I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago, in a distant land, there was a remote frontier settlement. This settlement was owned by one man, a greedy landlord. He owned the cabins people lived in, and he owned the store. Because everybody owed him money, they all had to work for him. One of the many who owed the greedy landlord money was a trapper. No matter how hard he worked, he could not rescue his family from poverty. It almost broke his heart that his 2 sons and loving wife were so poorly dressed and had so little to eat. His wife would do her best to stretch what little food they had, but there was not enough to go round for 2 growing boys and a husband. Every day the trapper would go out hunting and to visit his traps. If he had been able to sell his pelts to an honest trader, he would have been quite wealthy. While he was out hunting, his wife would sit at home in fear with the boys. Without fail, the landlord would appear and demand money. The poor woman would try to hide what little money they had, but he always found it in the end. He would search everywhere, demanding payment for repairs or for goods. He always found some reason for his demands, no matter how much she protested. He only did this while the trapper was away, because he was a coward. One day there was no money left and not enough food for the poorest meal. The landlord would not let the trapper have bullets or gunpowder unless he could take whatever the trapper shot. The poor family were facing hunger and ruin. Sadly, the trapper set off. The landlord watched him go. At once he headed towards the trapper's cabin. The older boy saw him coming and gave the warning. The family just had time to hide in the cellar before the landlord burst through the cabin door. At least she and the boys were safe, but the the few precious furs which the trapper was hoping to sell to an honest fur trader were not. The landlord realized their value the minute he saw them. Immediately, he fetched his son to help him collect the skins from where they had been drying. He did not care in the least that they belonged to someone else. The trapper came back just as the cruel pair were leaving. At once, the landlord claimed that the furs would go part of the way towards paying back what the trapper owed him. Horrified, the poor man's first thoughts were for the safety of his family. He had told them to seek safety in the cellar if the landlord came. He was very relieved when they came out safe and sound. His wife was terribly upset to see that the furs, their life savings, had been taken. There was only one last desperate hope. Hidden in the cellar was a skin of an enormous bear the trapper had shot. It was their last treasured possession. He would have to sneak away and take it many miles to a trading post where he would get its proper value. There was no way that this rogue was going to steal this skin or rob them of another penny. The trapper also decided to sell some old fishing nets that he no longer used. To a skilled hunter, escaping from the settlement without being seen or heard by the landlord was not much of a problem. Once away from the settlement, he still kept his wits about him. The countryside was full of danger, not only from animals, but also from outlaws and robbers. It was just as well he took care, because he had not gone more than a few miles when he heard distant laughter and could smell a campfire. Just in case there was danger, he crept silently forward. It was just as well he'd been cautious. He saw 3 rough-looking men. As he listened to their rowdy conversation, he was able to discover that they were indeed robbers. They were splitting up the proceeds of their latest raid. It had obviously been a great success. They had more gold and silver coins than the trapper had ever seen. He was a crafty man. Quietly and quickly, he wriggled back to where he'd left his gun and the bearskin. He pulled the bearskin over his body and then crawled forward on all fours, looking just like a real grizzly. When he came in sight of the robbers, he raised himself so that they would just be able to see the bear's great head, and he let out a fearsome growl. The robbers could not run away fast enough. Their only thought was to save themselves. They completely forgot all their gold. The trapper was delighted with the success of his trick. He lost no time in gathering up all the coins the robbers had abandoned. He put them quickly back into the bags. With all the extra weight to carry, he decided to leave the nets behind and return for them later. Now he had his bearskin and bags of gold coins too. He hurried home. His wife was amazed to see him back so early and most fearful that something dreadful had befallen him. She couldn't understand why he looked so cheerful, particularly as he obviously had not been able to sell the bearskin. But he soon put her mind at rest. "Look, wife," he cried as he handed her a gold coin. But how had he managed to get it? You can imagine how astonished she was when he then produced not one gold coin, but hundreds from the bags in his pockets. Her amazement soon turned to laughter as he told her what had happened. "Oh, we'll never want again!" she exclaimed in delight, and happily started counting out all the gold coins. Her husband had a better idea. He suddenly thought of a way to get even with their greedy landlord. Without further ado, he sent his wife across to the landlord's house. "May I borrow your scales?" she politely asked the landlord's wife. "My husband has so much money, we need the scales to measure the gold." The landlord's wife was as greedy as her husband. She was highly suspicious of the poor woman's story. As soon as she could, she hurried off to find her husband. Furious at her neighbor's good fortune, she was determined to get to the bottom of this strange story she'd been told. The trapper's wife happily returned home with the scales. Not only would their newfound wealth make all the difference to their lives, with any luck, their trick would teach the landlord a well-deserved lesson. The landlord had been staggered by his wife's story. He couldn't wait to see if it was true. His eyes stood out on stalks when he saw the kitchen table covered in gold coins. The trapper handed the landlord the money he was owed. He refused to say any more when that frenzied man demanded to know how the trapper had found all his wealth. "By simply minding my business," was all the trapper would say. It was a great joy no longer to be afraid of the landlord. With a great show, the trapper made several visits to the landlord's store to buy equipment for his trapping, always paying for the goods with a new gold coin. At last, he allowed the landlord to persuade him to explain exactly how he got all that money. The trapper would only say that when he left the settlement, he had the fishing nets, and when he returned, he had instead bags of gold. The landlord was no fool. If the trapper could obtain so much money for a few nets, how much more could he get if he made everybody pay for goods with fishing nets? His son was very puzzled. Word spread that the landlord had gone mad, and people flocked to pay for valuable goods with worthless old fishing nets. "The trapper may be rich, but I shall be richer," the landlord chuckled. Eventually, he thought he had enough nets to put the scheme to the test. He sent his son off to the nearest fishing village. It was, after all, the obvious place to sell nets for good gold, the only form of payment he was to accept. When the lad got to the fishing village, he found that not only was nobody interested in his nets at the price he asked, but he seemed to be part of some private joke nobody would share with him. When the landlord complained to his wife how the trapper had misled him, she was furious. The next time the landlord knew the trapper had gone out hunting, he rushed over to the trapper's cabin. But once again, the trapper's son saw him coming. When he burst into the cabin, he found the trapper's wife lying lifeless on the floor, with her children weeping next to her. He was walking straight into another trap. "Mama has died! Mama has died!" they cried to the startled man, and wept more and more loudly. Even the landlord was moved by their distress, but while he was wondering what to do, the trapper came in. "Don't worry, children," the trapper comforted his sons. Taking a pair of bellows, he gently blew them over his wife's face. He blew and blew, while the landlord watched, more and more puzzled by this behavior. Very shortly, the woman's eyes began to flutter, and her lips to part. She slowly opened her eyes. She was breathing again. The landlord was astounded by this extraordinary sight, and almost doubted what he'd seen. "These are magic bellows," the trapper explained to the landlord. "They will restore all dead things back to life." There was no limit to the value of such bellows. Without asking, the landlord grabbed them out of the trapper's hands and hurried back to his own home to try them out for himself. The trapper and his family truly enjoyed the success of their plan. The landlord's maidservant was preparing a goose for dinner. Perfect. The landlord applied the bellows with a will over the dead bird. He got hotter and hotter, crosser and crosser, blew harder and harder. But the bird showed no sign of life. To make matters worse, his wife entered the kitchen and watched scornfully as her husband puffed away. "Ha! Magic bellows indeed," she scoffed. "You deserve to be made a fool of if you believe such rubbish." She was quite right, of course. The clever trapper had tricked the landlord once again. He was furious at being made such a fool of for a second time. He would take the trapper by surprise and teach him a lesson he would never forget. Pretending to want a friendly word with the trapper, the landlord enticed him into the store. Before the man realized what was going on, he was thrust into a large, strong sack by the landlord and his burly son. The trapper was a hefty fellow and struggled furiously, but 2 against 1 just isn't fair. The two were soon able to get the trapper into the sack and tie it up tightly with strong twine. Despite the trapper's shouts and struggles, they managed to haul the bag up onto the son's shoulders and set off without any further ado, intent on finding a convenient river to throw the sack into. The son struggled with the sack. He was getting hotter and hotter every minute. Quite soon, the landlord was worn out. They decided to abandon the sack while they went in search of refreshment. The moment his captors had left, the trapper redoubled his efforts to free himself. He shouted and struggled, desperate to get out of the sack. Very soon, he attracted the attention of a passing traveller. He was most alarmed to come across a sack that had a life of its own. Taking due precautions, for who knew what kind of a trick this was, the traveller cautiously asked the sack what the matter was. I've been kidnapped by a rich farmer who wants me to marry his daughter. The trapper, who had been thinking fast, replied. But the fact is that I'm married already, and I don't want his wealth. If you let me out, I'll be quite happy for you to take my place. Well, that was a different matter. The traveller quickly undid the bag. The trapper, by now feeling very hot and bothered, gratefully thanked him. The farmer's just gone off to collect his daughter, he told his rescuer. He'll be back soon to get me. Frankly, all I want to do is go home to my wife. It all sounded too good to be true. The traveller lost no time in climbing into the sack. The trapper gave him a helping hand and tied up the sack tightly so no one would realize the difference. It was some time before the landlord and his son reappeared, very much the worse for drink. They were staggering about all over the road. They even had difficulty remembering exactly where they'd left the sack. By this time, the traveller was in no mood for tricks or horseplay. When the landlord and his son tried to pull the sack up, the traveller realised that this was no farmer and his daughter, but two drunks who may even try to rob him. Being kicked, thumped and dropped was bad enough. When he heard them talk about dumping the sack in the river, that was too much. Even if they'd been sober, the landlord and his son would have had difficulty understanding what was happening. But when somebody is chasing you with a big stick, it doesn't matter very much who he is. Very late that night, the landlord limped home, very much the worse for wear, to be greeted by a very angry wife. Although he tried to explain what a terrible time he'd been through, she didn't seem to care at all. In fact, she was not in the least thrilled to see him. The trapper and his wife were never bothered by the landlord again.